Good afternoon, everyone. We've got a few people still waiting to, still signing up. So I'm going to give it another couple of minutes to give people some more time to log in, and then we'll start the Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second of our autumn Blatchford autumn seminars. I'm coming out Basingstoke and the sun is out, which is very exciting, except obviously we're all stuck indoors. So hopefully you have a good view and you can at least look out the window while we go through this presentation. So this is on hydraulic ankle setup and alignment. I am Laura Ritchie, so I'll be doing most of the talking. I also have Kelvin Mills, who's one of our amputee demonstrators. He will be giving us an overview from his perspective on how the setup can be when it's not so good versus when it's spot on. And then we have Joe McCarthy and Kate Pearce online, as well as panellists who will be looking out for any questions, and they'll be available to answer any questions. So before we begin, or we have started, but before we carry on, everyone is muted. If you do have a question, you can add it onto the questions bit on the right hand side. So just type the question. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available to listen to again if you particularly enjoyed it, or for any of your colleagues who couldn't attend today. There are other webinars in the series, so you can look at this on our website. And if you do have any questions or any comments afterwards, please feel free to email me at the address below. So it's laura.ritchie@blatchford.co.uk. So we'll have a very, very brief hydraulic ankle overview, and then we'll go into the different aspects of alignment, starting with the bench alignment, and we'll finish with some troubleshooting. So really just hints and tips from our end as to where we've seen it go wrong and to help you get the most out of your hydraulic ankle setup. So we have a range of hydraulic ankles. They don't just they're not just for the active amputee. And the thing to consider is it's not just about the activity or the environment, but it's also about the person who's wearing the ankle. So we do have this Avalon is aimed just at the K2 amputee, and then our other hydraulic ankles There are some that are aimed at K2 and K3 and some more specifically designed for the K3 amputee. We're not going to go into the details of each of the feet, only to really point out that the Avalon is a non-carbon fibre foot, so it's made of a kind of nylon keel, whereas the other feet in the range are all carbon fibre, and therefore there's another factor to consider because we need to consider the carbon fibre springs. So these are the ones that are the energy storing and return hydraulic ankles. We're not going to focus on the Elan today in terms of how that is set up. There will probably be another webinar specifically looking at the Elan, but it's really just to go through everything from all the different aspects of alignment, and we will not go through the programming of the Elan, but we can do that on another session. But these feet that you can see on the screen, they all follow the same principles in terms of setup, with the exception of the echelon ER. So when we think about the carbon fibre springs, you have to think about the patient's weight and their activity level. So on our catalogue, and this is a snapshot from the catalogue page, this is suggesting that for K3 amputees, and this is for transtibial users, this is the spring selection for that. So if the only thing I would say is for a fixed ankle, so if this was one of our fixed ankle energy storing feet, then you would go with the spring selection that's marked on the chart. So for example, say we had a 75 kilogram amputee, then they would, and they were a BK transtibial K3, they would be spring rating 4. However, when we think about our hydraulic ankles that have carbon fibre springs, it's always better to go up to the next spring rating should they be in that top half of the weight bracket. So in this particular case, say the amputee was 72 kilograms, you would stick to the spring rate 4, but because they're 75, they're pushed into that top half, then they would go up to the spring rating 5. If the springs are too soft, then it does become a bit harder for the user to walk over the course of the day, and they potentially become more tired. So we want to get the best out of the springs. So that's my first hint or little tip, just to make sure you go up. Obviously, it will be different if they're a K2 amputee, then you won't. Yeah, in this example here, if they were 75 kilograms but K2, you would stick to the rating 4. So we do advise everything's based on K3 users. For K2 users, you would typically go down anyway. For K4s, you may go up, and for above knees, you may also typically go down, so that the foot was a bit softer for an above knee. So going on to our bench alignment, so you can see on the left, so this is one of our regular hydraulic ankles. So when I say regular, I mean not the latest one, so we're not including the echelon ER in this particular bench alignment example, but this will cover the same for Avalon, echelon, echelon back, echelon VT and Elan. We want to use this wedge that you can see in the photograph and also in the diagram on the right. So previously we did not have this alignment wedge, and you used to just have to move the foot throughout the range in order to feel what was roughly 1/3 to 2/3 in terms of your range of motion. So the carbon fibre feet, again with the exception of the echelon ER, they have 9 degrees of movement, and the Avalon has 12 degrees. Now we want to have 6 degrees of plantar flexion for all those feet, and therefore either 3 degrees of dorsiflexion, or in the case of the Avalon, 6 degrees of dorsiflexion. So starting from the bottom, use the wedge because it makes life much easier. Put the shoe on the foot and then fully plantar flex the foot, so that all the movement in the ankle is in the plantar flexion range. And then if the foot has this cross hatching that you can again see on the right, then use that as your reference line. So that is really saying that the cross-hatching corresponds to just 5 mil behind where the actual ankle pivot is, which is where we're targeting. Not all the feet, unfortunately, have that cross-hatching. So the Echelon VT doesn't have it at the moment as part of the graphics. However, on the foot shell, there's a little dimple with the new foot shells to represent that 1/3 position. So use your reference line, either line it up with the foot shell dimple or with the cross hatching, and then you want to make sure that the socket, that the centre of the socket is lining up with that. So it's straightforward bench alignment. I would just say if you don't have a wedge, just make sure you have one. We can send them out wherever you are in the world. It's a super expensive piece of grey foam. You can also use it as a doorstop. They're quite handy for a doorstop. But definitely use the wedge because it will make your life so much easier when you're doing your alignment. For the Echelon ER, so some of you won't have seen this. This has only been launched just a couple of weeks ago, actually, or maybe a month ago. What we do with the wedge is we turn it around. So it's the same principle in terms of putting the shoe on, and then instead of having the fatter part of the wedge at the back, we have it at the front, and we want to fully dorsiflex the foot. So it's the opposite to what you would do with the other feet. And the reason for that is that there's more range of motion in this, but what it allows, when we do it previously, we know that then with the wedge is set to 6 degrees. So we know that if we fully plantar flex the foot on the other feet and then remove the wedge, we know that we have the 6 degrees of plantar flexion that we want. With the Echelon ER, we want to have 6 degrees of dorsiflexion, and then the rest of the alignment will be in plantar flexion. Therefore, if you turn the wedge around and set it up fully dorsiflex, when you remove the wedge and the foot settles, it will be in that 19 degrees of plantar flexion and 6 degrees of dorsiflexion. So the wedge will become your friend if you're fitting hydraulic ankles, and don't do them without it. I should have said actually, let me just go back. In terms of, again, with AK amputees, the alignment is the same in terms of the reference point on the socket. So we want the centre of the socket to be going through that back 1/3 of the foot. So for both BK and AK. So moving on to our static alignment. For the most part, if you've done the bench alignment correctly, you'll have a really good starting point. And when the foot is aligned properly, the user should be able to stand in the neutral point of the foot with minimal muscle effort. Having said that, for anyone who's new to hydraulic ankles, it can often take a couple of weeks for fixed ankle users to then get used to the movement, and it may feel that within that week or 2 week period that they find that they're using their core muscles more while they adjust, but they will get used to it, and it will feel normal after a relatively short period of time. And you can see in the graphics as well that if you have to have the foot position correct, so that's why we say it's the back 1/3, and if you don't have it correct, you'll have either hyper extension moment or hyperflexion moment. I would say if you have someone who their centre of mass is perhaps further forward than on other patients, so they maybe have a bit of a belly, then even though if you do your bench alignment as normal, so as we've recommended, you may find that their centre of mass is too far forward over the foot, and they will require the foot to be shifted forward relative to the socket so that their weight line then passes further behind. So it's just depending on where the user's actual centre of mass is. And when the alignment is optimum, this is what you should see. So obviously most of us don't have gait labs in our clinic, but the red line here is quite helpful in terms of if we have our setup correct. So Kelvin, this is quite an old video. If you saw the rest of Kelvin, you probably see that he has short hair, whereas he's sitting beside me, his mask on with his long hair. So it shows how old the video is. But he can stand like this because everything's in alignment. So his centre of mass is above his centre of pressure, and therefore his hip and his knee and his ankle are all in alignment, meaning that he has minimal turning moments around each of the joint, and therefore minimal muscle effort to stabilise and to have this natural balance. So that's what it should look like when it's set up correctly. And then again, what we would, in an ideal world, it's not always possible. I think the recording stopped, but I hope you can also hear me. If anyone can't, then just let me know. It does mean you can swear now because we're not being recorded. If we have our setup optimum, then on a slope, on like a 10-degree slope, then this is what you should see. So facing up the slope on the picture on the left, the foot is flat against the ground, so he's on a slope but the foot's conformed. And then facing down the slope on the right, again you can see that the foot's flat on the ground. So what we don't want to see is when Kelvin faces down the slope, we don't want to see that the toe is off the ground, because then that means we either haven't got the shift correct, or we've done something with our plantar flexion range. So we've set it up with insufficient plantar flexion range. So it's not always possible to do this before you really look at the walking, because most clinics probably don't have a slope in the clinic room, but at some point during your gait, during your alignment, then you really should be doing static standing on a slope. And then you can move on to the dynamic. So the first thing that you want to do is set the resistances, and the first one being the plantar flexion resistance, as you can see on the left. So this is going to look at heel strike to mid stance, and you'll see the speed of how quickly the foot falls to the floor or goes down will depend on what the resistance is. With the Avalon, we only have one valve, so we have one hydraulic valve, and there's like 3 settings, or there's point settings in between, but there's 1, 2, or 3 on the Avalon. And I would set up more so with the valve suiting the plantar flexion rather than the dorsiflexion range. And then on the echelon, on the other feet, the carbon fibre feet, we have 9 different resistance levels for plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. So the next one would be the dorsiflexion. Once you're happy with how the plantar flexion is looking, then have a look at the dorsiflexion, and again just adjust it so you're looking at how it goes from mid stance to toe off in this case. And then ask your amputee to walk on level ground. So they should be able to walk. I hope the video is playing okay. It might be a bit jumpy, but really what you want to see is that the foot is coming nicely down. We're trying to get it to as closely match the intact side as possible for unilateral amputees. And in this case, hopefully you can see that it's doing that. What we don't want is the foot to slap down. And we also don't want the heel to be, the user to be standing on the heel for too long and waiting for the foot to then come down, because that will just encourage the knee to go into flexion. So we want to have this nice balance. You should see a smooth transition through stance when the resistances are set correctly. Sometimes if you notice that there's a dead spot, or the amputee tells you it feels like there's a bit of a lag or there's a dead spot, then it's worth just double checking your bench alignment. Check that, and your static alignment as well. Kind of look to see where the user is relative to the foot, and then play around with the resistances to see if maybe stiffening the heel or softening the heel can take away that dead spot. So it's trying to find the balance between the plantar flexion and dorsiflexion resistance. And with all the feet, when the user sits down, the foot will plantar flex. So there's a benefit in terms of comfort. On the Echelon ER, because we have more plantar flexion range, then obviously you will see more plantar flexion when the user sits down. But what's, so I think I said earlier, there's 19 degrees of plantar flexion on the Echelon ER compared to 6 degrees for the other feet. So it does make it more comfortable for sitting. But what we don't then see is suddenly lots more movement coming from the foot during walking. So despite how much plantar flexion you saw in the previous video for sitting, we don't see that actually during the gait cycle. And it's because of the viscoelastic nature of these energy storing and return hydraulic feet, whereby some of the movement is coming from the deflection of the springs. So the springs are behaving elastically, and when the weight goes onto the spring will compress and then it will return. But the ankle uses a kind of viscoelastic nature, so it works a little bit like a shock absorber. So for any of our hydraulic ankles, you don't want to see lots of movement during gait, because actually it could become a bit unstable, and don't expect to see a lot of movement. So it doesn't mean that it's not working well when you don't see, you know, the full range, especially for the Echelon ER. So moving on to troubleshooting, we do have a guide. So when you order the foot, it comes with the setup guide, and there's little helpful tips on how to do the troubleshooting. When the alignment isn't optimum, you'll either see this on the left, you can see it's hyperextending. So again, this is Kelvin. He's sort of struggling to find his balance. Trying to avoid tipping back. So you'll see that if the load line is too far behind, so it's going too far back through the foot. And then on the right, we have the opposite effect. So if the socket is too far forward, so the foot's too far back and the load line is too anterior, then there'll be this hyperflexion moment. And while the foot will adapt and the amputee will still be able to stand, they'll be fighting more so statically. And more so than if they had a fixed ankle, because obviously that's just set up. Usually we set that up so that they can stand stably. So make sure that when they're standing, that you see the video that we saw earlier on. And again, for an AK amputee, you can see if the foot is too far forward and the weight line is coming back, he will struggle to stand the same way in reverse. Sorry, oops. Sorry, just going back. Well, you probably don't need to see that because it's the same as before. So make sure in this bit, the key here is whatever your alignment is, if it's not correct, what we don't want to do is just do an angular adjustment. So any adjustments that we need to do, we have to physically move the foot. So in the video that you see, we would want to physically move the foot forward in order that the weight line is further back. If you just do angular adjustments, so either just flex or extend the socket, then what you're effectively doing is altering the range, the ratio of the range of motion at the ankle, and you won't have the same benefit from walking. The ankle won't give you the same adjustment or the same effects, especially coming down slopes or going up slopes. So you need to shift the foot. And with any adjustment, because on a fixed foot, anything that you adjust the foot will not conform to the ground, whereas on the hydraulic ankle it will. So anytime that you do an adjustment, just make sure the user kind of marches on the spot and gets the new position so that the foot then conforms and you can see exactly what your adjustment has been. But please make sure you shift. So it's ideal if you can have either use a shift adapter or have top and bottom pyramid adapters so that you can flat shift the foot relative to the socket. Let me just put the sound off. So if the resistance, I'm going to bring Kelvin in here, you can hopefully see the video. If the resistance is too soft, then you'll see this foot slap. And I just want Kelvin to kind of tell us when it's not set up properly for you, like what is it that you would feel if the heel's too soft or the toe's too soft?
Well, with the heel too soft, you certainly sink at the back. Then you don't get the momentum or thrust to get onto the toe, so you get like a stalling sensation, sort of mid-stance. It doesn't actually look too bad there, but you certainly feel it. Obviously, vice versa when it's too stiff.
So, and then when it's too hard?
When it's too hard, it's like a sort of shock to the heel. You certainly feel it, and going up through your thigh. It does walk quick. It's almost like your foot's in like a ski boot or something that's sloped. So it's propelling you too fast, really, for a sort of normal sort of speed kind of walk, sort of an average speed walk. It encourages you to walk too quickly because you want to get off the heel and onto the toe, and then you think that the next step's going to be comfortable, but it actually isn't.
And you were saying, sorry, we've both got our masks on, so it might sound a bit muffled. You were saying earlier when we were having a chat that quite often you will feel it's okay. So if I was to look at these, as you said, it doesn't look too bad,
no.
And you might say, oh yeah, it's okay. But
well, I think when you're fitting somebody one of these for the first time, is to go with the static alignment, get them to walk around on it, maybe come back and sit down, eat for half an hour or so, and then go again, and then ask them what they think. And if they think it's comfortable and you don't, maybe just adjust it slightly too hard, go up a setting or even two. Certainly the other thing to do as well is they're much better if you've worn one the first day you've got one, go home, go to bed, get up in the morning and put that on again, because it feels completely different the second day. And it might be that, you know, give them 2 weeks even, and then review it over the phone, or get them to come back and take a walk around, and they might want it adjusted, because there's certainly a sweet spot on those. Once you get it right, they're unbelievable. They make such a difference to your day. You know, from 97% of the things you're going to do, there's no better lit. The only thing they're not really good at is running. They're good for anything else. They're good for cycling. They're good for going to work. They're even good for kneeling down on the floor, because the foot moves a bit, gives you a bit of stability if you're a plumber or a carpet fitter. There's so many little things that you don't think about. Going up ladders, coming down ladders, obviously going up and down hills. It's also surprising, if you go for a walk over some sort of undulating ground, how much quicker you cover the same distance that you would even with a sports lift. You know, particularly with muddy or wet grass. So it's worth giving the patient the opportunity to take one away as well. If they don't like it immediately, they say it's too heavy, you know, just give them a couple of days on it, and they'll soon change their mind. Particularly the next day. I think sometimes when you put one on, when you first prescribe one, you might think that it's a bit heavier than what you're used to. But as long as you've got a decent vacuum, I mean, I've only got, you know, the one-way valve vacuum, and it doesn't feel heavy. So yeah, definitely encourage them to take it home. Try it again the next morning, and I think they'll be massively surprised at how much better it is.
Kelvin, it's Joe. Would you make a comment again about what you feel if the dorsiflexion resistance is too low, and conversely, if you feel the dorsiflexion resistance too high?
Yeah. We still. So if you get dorsiflexion is too soft, you almost feel like you're going to stumble over the toe. And conversely, if the resistance is too stiff, it feels like the foot's too long, and it's like you're overcoming quite a stiff lever. So you know, it's definitely worth experimenting with the patient on the first day, but also I think, you know, again, give them a couple of weeks and see what they think. But generally, I find that when you go onto one and it's set up, the dorsiflexion, you feel like you've got the right setting, but you can always go just slightly stiffer. So it'd be worth encouraging to try that as well on the day, definitely. It's not so bad with plantar flexion being too soft. It can actually make the leg, the whole foot feel much more comfortable. And you know, and if you're in a sort of indoor environment, that's probably the better way to go. And then, you know, if someone walks fast or does a lot of outdoor stuff, then you probably want it just slightly stiffer.
Cool. I certainly find, so Kelvin is very active amputee, walks really well on most things. Like, I could give him any foot, and after, honestly, like just about 2 steps, Kelvin will adapt to the foot. So it makes it harder when you have somebody like Kelvin to really see what the negatives are or where you need to change the alignment, because you'll walk very well on anything. So if you're really, I would advise you to really ask lots of questions. So if you think that it looks good, quite often, you know, you put it on straight out the box. I should have said the resistances are set, they should be set to 8 and 8 for the plantar flexion and the dorsiflexion on the carbon fibre feet. And I can't remember now, I think it's set to 2 on the Avalon. But what you really want is a stiff enough resistance that when they're coming off a fixed ankle, they don't suddenly feel that there's lots of movement and feel unstable. So we need to have enough resistance on there, and then sometimes it looks okay, and I certainly don't like that, because I like to know that I've done an adjustment. It makes me feel like I've earned my money if I've made some sort of change. So I would definitely play around with the resistances, and if it still looks fine, really ask the questions. So break it down into what's happening at the heel. So that's all about your plantar flexion resistance. So asking, so I would be saying to Kelvin, oh, when you take a step, how does the heel feel? Do you feel that you're sinking at the heel? Does it feel like it's too hard, that you've stepped on a stone, or are you feeling that your knee's being kind of thrown forward? So ask these questions, because then it gives you an idea of what the adjustments that you need to do are. Obviously, it might be really obvious if you see that the toe is not coming down quickly and there's a delay, then it's more than likely that it's the plantar flexion resistance is too stiff, too hard, and so you want to just too high rather, and you want to just turn that down. So turn it down gradually, and then if everything looks, you know, you've done all the resistance changes and you think the alignment's okay and it's still, you know, the patient's not quite right, then just work through it again methodically, but always think about what's happening at the heel first, then look at the progression through mid stance, and then kind of look at what's happening at the toe. That would be my advice. And this slide that you can see, this is actually really useful to have either in your back pocket. You could have it tattooed onto your forearm, or, you know, just leave it out in the office and sort of pop backwards and forwards. Certainly if you haven't fitted hydraulic ankles before, or you haven't done very many, this is probably the one thing that I would have with you, just to make sure that you're doing it right. Amputees will often kind of say it feels like the foot's too long. If either your shift alignment's not right or the plantar flexion's too stiff, they might feel like the foot feels too long, or it feels like they're kind of walking uphill. So really try and get in tune with what your patient's telling you, in terms of how they feel, and then don't be afraid to do some adjustments later. Quite often, again, someone who's new to hydraulics will maybe keep the resistances quite high. So maybe we leave them on 8 and 8 and let them go away, and then expect that when they come back, they've got a bit more used to having that movement at the ankle, that we'll want to reduce the resistances. So I'm guessing there's probably not any questions, because nobody seems to like asking questions, but does anyone have any questions at all? I think there was one I saw earlier about what the resistances should be. So they're set to 8 and 8. Typically, we find that for plantar flexion, it probably doesn't go much below 7. So you might find the plantar flexion resistance stays kind of 7, it might stay at 8, and the dorsiflexion rarely is higher than 6. If you find that the resistances, if you've got somebody and they're on kind of 4 plantar flexion, 1 dorsiflexion, the chances are that the springs will be too stiff. Just getting that right in my head. And you're having to compensate from movement at the ankle. And if you change the springs, you can probably then stiffen the hydraulic resistances. And it's the same the other way. If you find that you're on kind of 9 and 9 on both, then the user is wanting to feel more energy come from the springs. So it may well be that the carbon fibre springs are just a bit too soft. And if you go up one category, you should be able to find that you can change the hydraulics to be more optimal for all round. Were there any other questions that I've missed?
I've got one, Laura. Someone here written in saying they've aligned 2 patients exactly the same, using the wedge and the bisected the socket just as you described. And they said sort of one of them felt that their knee kept flexing and moving forward, and the other was going, you know, as you'd expect, just gently into extension as they stood there. And I think it comes back to the point you raised earlier about, well, it could come back to the point you raised earlier about somebody's build. If you've got someone with a big tummy, their center of mass will be further forward, so the knee would tend to, or could tend to flex more with those. The other thing I would say is it could be is just check that you've got the flexion properly accommodated as well, because that's the other thing. You need to accommodate any flexion that the person has as well. So that was one of the ones I had. And then there's another, okay. The same person said, you know, one of them found his hydraulic ankle tiring, and I think that comes back. I'm not 100% sure. It could come back to the AP position not being right if the forefoot's too long, but it's more likely that there's excessive hydraulic movement from the ankle, and I always think, you know, so like when the ankle's set up properly, if you're adjusting plantar flexion, if the plantar flexion's too soft, as you showed there, the foot will just flop down, loads of ankle rotation, and what we're doing is actually having the hydraulic take energy out, so we're not putting energy into the heel spring to push the person forward. Similarly, if we have the hydraulic too hard, the energy goes into the heel spring, propelling the person forward. I mean, they didn't give any more details. I don't know if Samesh you want to contact again, but just saying it was tiring. I mean, it could be tiring because you've got too much dorsiflexion resistance, you know, and making the forefoot feel longer. So it's just around those points. And I mean, if anyone has any problems when they're setting one of these up and wants to contact one of the sales team, I'm sure, you know, they can help over the phone as best they can. If not, you could always get one of them along if you have a problem with it.
Yeah, so another couple of questions actually. One's about resistances. So do we feel we change the resistances? The question's now disappeared, but I kind of wrote notes. So do resistances for setting up with MPKs or for yielding knees when they're yielding down slopes or stairs. In terms of, from my perspective, the resistances, not really what I've noticed in the positive way is that when fitting with an MPK, so in our case it would be the Orion. Obviously I have seen Echelon VTs on sea legs, so it's not so much about the knee itself, but certainly having the movement, having the plantar flexion movement on a gentle slope, then it means that the users don't need to then yield down a slope. So amputees will always have choices, and they either, for an above knee amputee, they'll either come to a slope and they'll look at the pitch of the slope and the length of the slope and decide, do I need to yield or can I just jackknife over the knee? And if the slope is short enough, then they'll probably just think, right, I'll just kind of almost run down the slope, and then it becomes quite flat. But what I found is that you actually have a better range coming from the knee. So on those gentle slopes, then the amputees feel really stable because it feels like they're just walking on level ground, and the foot is accommodating everything. So the resistance wouldn't be any different than what you would set it up for level ground on those gentle slopes. And then the only thing that is different when considering like MPKs or yielding knees is quite often that means you can better fine tune the resistance and the yield to suit a steeper slope. So whereby the foot, with the exception of the echelon ER, the foot won't have enough range to accommodate a steeper slope. Then the user has to then use the yield resistance, but you can make the yield higher and they give more support because you don't need to have the yield resistance set for a gentle slope. So hopefully that's answered that. Joe, do you want to comment on, only because I've only fitted one echelon ER, but do you have any comments on how the range, the resistances might be affected?
Yeah, I mean, certainly with an echelon ER, what we saw on our evaluations when we fitted people with them was that people could walk up and down steeper slopes more easily with the extended range, as you'd expect. But the really surprising thing was, if you compared walking, say, with an Orion, going leg in front of leg down the slope, not yielding, so walking normally, the echelon ER allowed the person to walk down steeper slopes without the knee going to the high yield than was possible with an echelon VT. I mean, we proved this outside Crystal Palace. The path opposite was the patient actually said to us, oh, I can walk down steeper slopes after he'd had it home. And sure enough, he could. And we swapped back to his original echelon VT. And sure enough, the thing was locking up down that slope. But you need to make sure that the second foot can contact the ground, on those slopes for the knee to release properly. And certainly that's what we saw. I mean, words of caution, I would say with the echelon ER, foot placement is more critical if you're yielding leg over leg downstairs, because the foot will tend to plant to flex if you just have the heel on the step. So you've got to position the foot slightly further back than you would normally with say a regular, echelon. Those are the things that I would say that I've noticed there.
Sorry, I misread the first question. So it wasn't to resistances, it was range of motion. No, once you've set the range of motion, I would leave it as it is. There'll always be, I mean, the echelon ER has more range of motion, so that will be a better foot. If you have somebody maybe on an MPK on a knee that yields and they're very active, they're navigating uneven terrain, they're navigating lots of slopes and or hills, in England I would call them hills, but in Scotland obviously they're called mountains. So if you've got somebody where actually they are on quite steep slopes, then it may well be that the echelon with the extended range of motion, so having more plantar flexion, that would be a better foot for them. But once they're set up, I wouldn't adjust the range. Sometimes if people are going to wear like higher heels, in the past I've put the foot into, more of the range has been in plantar flexion to suit the heel height. So effectively, I guess that's similar to if they're walking down a steeper slope potentially. But that's always at the compromise of then they don't have the same degree of plantar flexion. So you can use up all the range of the foot to suit a particular slope, but then it will affect their level ground walking. So generally, once it's set for level ground, then I would leave it as it is. There's another question just about bilaterals. So would we set it up any differently or approach things differently for bilateral users? In terms of the static alignment, then yes, what you typically find, with the exception of an Elan, so the Elan has the standing mode, and that behaves more like a fixed ankle when the patient's standing still, because the resistances will ramp up to the maximum. obviously on all the other feet where the resistance. And Joe, can you mute yourself for a second? I think Joe's gone out in the garden. Yeah, where we... Can you mute yourself though? Thank you. So I've lost my train of thought. Now, for bilaterals, so static balance, for bilaterals, the elan is better, but what you typically will see is that they'll rest on the front dorsiflexion stop. So when you see them standing, it might look like they're standing in this almost like crouched gait, if you think about cerebral palsy kids, or just that hyperflexion stance. And it's really just they feel more stable when they know that there's no movement further forward. I wouldn't be so worried about that personally, just for static balance. I think it's okay if they rest on that. Joe was, in the past, when Joe and I have chatted about this, Joe's kind of suggested, well, maybe, you know, if they can't have elans on both sides, you know, maybe have it on one, where one will be stiff, or even like, yeah, if they're an above knee amputee, it may be that you think actually you want movement on one side, but you may decide that on the other side you want a fixed ankle. I've seen that done in the past. But in terms of the alignment, no, I would do the alignment exactly the same, with the only, and the resistance is exactly the same. The only thing would be just how it looks statically. Does anyone get anything else to add for bilaterals, Joe or Kate?
From me, Kate, have you got anything?
Nothing to add on bilaterals, but I have a question here for Kelvin, if he wouldn't mind answering. Just in terms of what's your preference between Echelon, Echelon VT and Echelon ER, if you've tried one, particularly now that we have the MPK packages that offer all of those three options. So thinking about, sorry.
I tend to use the Echelon VT mode purely because of the, you know, the shock absorption from the VT unit. It's one of those feet that you can just walk on pretty much all day and not get tired with it. So it's quite good for the sort of stump health. It sort of stops the shearing so much. When I'm talking, you know, having it on all day, I mean like a really long walk of over 6-7 miles, which it's not normal to walk that far, even if you're able-bodied. Just the fact that you've got something like that and it allows you to do it from previous limbs sort of bears testament, you know, to how good our hydraulic ankle is. So I think that's my favourite one. I do like the elan, but we weren't really talking about that. But I do quite like walking on that one as well. But I think as it is at the moment, the Echelon VT is my favourite.
You definitely say the torsion is better for you than the extended range at the minute.
Yeah, only because I like, if I go for a walk, I like to go for a really long one, and it's one of those feet that you're not going to get worried that you get so far and you think, oh, you know, I've got to come back the same distance I've just gone. It sort of allows you to do that, and I find, I don't know whether it's because it's got the shock absorption, but it's all the hydraulic ankles help. If you've got a problem with it, I always got like a niggling sort of neck problem and a shoulder problem, and all the hydraulic ankles seem to help with that quite a lot. But the VT one just clears it up almost immediately. So you know you've been wearing it because you go to bed the next morning, you wake up and you haven't got the niggly shoulder or neck. So it definitely you know, absorbs something there and keeps you more symmetrical. So yeah, that's probably my favourite one. Probably 95% of what I do is on one of those. The only other time I don't use it is for a sport activity, and then I just use an energy storing foot then.
Any other questions? We're just having a look through the
I was going to make a comment actually on that. Was that certainly on the ER, when we first put people on the Echelon ER, there was people who loved the shock absorption and tried it, And the one thing that they did miss was the torsional compliance. There was one chap is a painter, and he said, you know, loved the ER, but for the torsional movement when he was painting, the BT was sort of like something he just couldn't do without, like that torsional movement. And I mean, the other thing for transfemorals to remember, if you are fitting a transfemoral with one of these devices, then the beauty of it is that it makes the knee even more stable at heel strike. And certainly there was some surveys carried out, and you know, the people who scored more highly than transtibials were the transfemorals in the way they liked the echelon type, the hydraulic ankles, because of the extra security that they felt. You know, that's what when we drilled down through the detail, that's what they actually said. There's, of course, there's all the clinical evidence around that. I mean, sort of, I don't know, you know, I'm sure everyone's sick to death of hearing about all the white papers with that sort of information in, but it's all in there as well.
So if there aren't any more questions, sorry, we've ran over the time. I kind of guessed really at half an hour. It was to entice everyone to join. I thought if you all thought it was just half an hour instead of an hour, you'd be more likely to join. But thanks very much for listening. I hope it's been helpful. And please, if you do have any questions or you're doing any fittings, contact your sales kind of rep, wherever you are in the world. Nowadays, we can do a lot more via Teams, FaceTime, WhatsApp video. So yeah, if we can't physically get to your clinic on the day of the appointment, if you've got a patient in, then just give us a video call. We're always looking at our best. My hair's not been cut since July, but other than that, we're all looking great. So we're happy to do any kind of help over the phone or video, or just email us your questions. And yeah, have a good rest of the day, good rest of the week. In the UK, we're back into a bit of a lockdown, or in England we are anyway. Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, I'm sure, are about to follow. So keep safe and stay out of trouble, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Bye.